Yeah, thanks very much. And I am still learning a lot about what you're doing over here, but I was really amazed at the potential when I came last year. Sorry to be the wise man from the east and also keep you from your break. I'll try and get through it quickly. Some of it you've heard, but I thought I'd run through a bit of what we've been doing and then a little bit at the end of what I saw here last year and what I think we might be able to do next. Basically, if you're talking about dual-purpose wheat or canola, there are a range of different systems where you can adopt these things, and we've been talking about the range of them today. Obviously, a lot of the early grazing crop stuff started with oats and other crops in the tablelands where they've been doing it for a long time. Very early sowing with winter types, lots of grazing on and off, and then harvesting for yield. What really happened in southern New South Wales when wedgetail was released in 2002 was suddenly farmers had a high protein, a milling grade quality wheat that really was a game changer for the number of people who wanted to get into this, because with a milling quality wheat rather than a feed wheat, the numbers really started to stack up for people in more sort of traditional mixed farming areas. So wedgetail was certainly a real catalyst to that. Unfortunately, wheat streak mosaic virus hit us very hard in 2005 and made people very shy to put wheat in early, which is where the canola came in as another sort of high-value grain option. But look, I guess wherever you are, whether it's Western Australia or over in the east, the principles are the same. You're trying to get the thing in early enough to create some excess biomass. You're wanting to keep really your flowering window the same because you don't want a yield penalty. So you're sort of working back from that, and it's just a matter of how much of this biomass and when can you safely take it to not affect yield. If you make a lot of money out of your sheep, you can cop a bit of a trade-off, but the guys in most of the cropping areas who don't have a lot of animals and are into their crops are really looking for no trade-off. They don't want any yield loss at all, so they're more sort of doing this kind of clip grazing stuff. These guys, if they've got if lambs are good prices, they might be willing to take a hit on some of their crop. So we really did start out doing a lot of work on that top one, the tablelands, with McKellar and all the old sort of CSIRO and New South Wales Ag winter wheats. And just to show you that, whether you're in a 1 tonne year or a 4 tonne year or a 7 tonne year, provided you follow this rule about locking up in the safe window, you can graze these things right down to that in July in our area, and in October you won't tell the difference, and as you can see here, you get an enormous amount of grazing off them with no yield penalty. And in tough seasons, a little bit of grazing even conserves a bit of moisture and gives you a yield kick in some years. So actually, through the 2000s, we had such tough years in the east that it was a lot more like Western Australia than we'd like to believe. And so the fact that a lot of this grazing canola and cereals worked through that period gives you some hope that in other tighter areas that it can also work. But having said that, there's also guys who do the clip grazing. Here's a crop of Gregory in 2008. As I said, more like we've been discussing here, so there's quite a bit of interest in this. Somebody mentioned the supplement work. Essentially, wheat excludes sodium at its roots. So wheat forage is desperately low in sodium as far as an animal's concerned. And if an animal doesn't have sodium in its rumen, it tends to get a high potassium to sodium ratio, and it can't absorb magnesium. So that's why when animals are grazing wheat, if you supplement them with sodium, you fix the ratio. If you supplement directly with magnesium, you fix the magnesium problem. And if you give them a salt-cause mag mix, you sort of get the best of both worlds. So we've never really had much less than a 20 to 40% increase in live weight gain of sheep or cattle grazing wheat, and only wheat, when they've been supplemented. So this was all Hugh Dove's work, and I think most people are aware of it, but it's not the case for canola or barley or oats. It's because wheat excludes sodium at its root. I got interested in dual-purpose canola for two reasons. Through the 2000s, people were dropping out of canola, and I'd spent 10 years convincing people to grow it as a break crop, and through the drought it was so risky and people were losing so much money that I was concerned it was just dropping right out. So I was looking for a way to make canola more profitable and less risky. And in the high rainfall areas, basically people were moving into high rainfall areas and putting dual purpose wheat in, sowing it early, growing it for a long time in wet conditions, you were just setting yourself up for disease and weed problems, and they had heroic sort of weed issues. They'd try to go back to a perennial pasture and it had failed because of the weeds that had built up. So they needed a break crop. So they were the two reasons I got interested in seeing if we could graze canola. And we basically did a lot of work starting in 2004 to come up with a whole lot of guidelines, which Phil has already passed on to you, and you guys have been trying it over here. The principles work, the numbers might be different, the times might be different, but I won't go through all of these. I'll just show you a little bit of the data that's behind them. If you want to produce biomass for early grazing, sow early. There's a difference between 15th of April and 29th of April when you come in to graze in June. Sow a hybrid rather than a TT, and make sure your nitrogen nutrition is adequate but not over the top. You really do need adequate nitrogen to drive this early growth in the autumn. Here's the Blackleg data. This is all work from Susie Sprague. We really knew that unless you could graze canola safely with respect to Blackleg, and this was what we spent the first 3 years working out, we just weren't going to go forward with it at all, because ripping all the leaves and stems off in the middle of winter and opening the crop up to that organism could have just been basically, we could have stopped it right then. What Susie showed is if you use resistant varieties, in those days it was a rating of sort of up to 9, now it's R or MR. If you use these resistant varieties, the increase in Blackleg infection caused by grazing is very small, and these sort of levels of internal infection are not really going to be yield limiting. But if you use a variety that's low resistance, you will really increase your Blackleg and get a lot of lodging and failure. We've also shown, I haven't put it here, that grazing late, grazing past that stem elongation makes this even worse, and some of these varieties have become susceptible. And I think it's because Blackleg normally has to go in through the leaf, through the stomate, work its way down the PDL, get down to the base of the plant and create a canker. And it's along that pathway that all of our resistance lies. If you basically just have a stem and you take the top off it, then the Blackleg can just get straight into the xylem and go straight down the highway to the stem, and probably it's bypassing most of our polygenic resistance processes. So yeah, be aware that you need to use a high resistant variety. We've talked about grazing times, and really it's all about grazing whenever you can start, and it's worthwhile to you. Watching this bud, because once the bud starts to elongate and you bite that off, plant's going to be delayed. And this is our data from a range of different sites over the years. This is the stage at which you remove the animals. You can see if it's vegetative or bud visible, very little delay in flowering, 2 to 3 days, maybe up to 5 days if you take the animals off then. Once you start letting the bud elongate and you're letting animals graze that bud, here you are with 40 days delay in flowering. So that's not going to be particularly useful to you unless you're trying to hold back a crop from frost that you've sown in February or something. So generally we say graze before this thing elongates beyond 10 centimetres, and you're unlikely to get a delay in flowering that's going to create yield penalties. But the tighter environment you're in, the shorter season you're in, the more critical that's going to be. In terms of grazing intensity and residual biomass, we really did graze quite hard early on when we were trying the Blackleg. I mean, I just assumed farmers would graze the crap out of it, and I wanted to make sure I knew what was going to happen with Blackleg. So we really did some quite heavy grazing. So this was on the 28th of July. This was how the crop looked, and then that year it came back to sort of 2.9 tonnes versus 3.4. So there's a bit of a yield penalty there, but who would think that a canola crop that looked like that on the 28th of July was going to yield 2.9 tonnes? I mean, it's quite amazing. So sort of as the stock are grazing it down, this is cattle grazing at Goulburn, I guess the next set of rules I think we need are to ask, if we're in the safe window, what then is the residual biomass we can tolerate at different times, depending on where we are? That's the fine-tuning I think we need, that we're trying to do now. And so I put a whole lot of my data together for young. This is the same farm at Young. We went back, I did about 7 experiments here over the 3 years on different things, but what I've got here is the yield penalty from grazing. So 100 means there's no yield penalty. It's the same as the ungrazed, and then 80% means you've had a 20% yield penalty, etc. This is the time we locked up, and I've plotted data from a whole range of experiments, and the numbers are the biomass that was there at the time we locked up. So farmers in this area generally say, just the consultant's sort of rule of thumb is get the animals out before the end of July. This was the sort of working wisdom, and it looks pretty good. And I think what we've got here is a period here where it's phenologically safe and it's physiologically safe to graze pretty hard. Those crops I showed you, so this is down to 0.07 of a tonne per hectare, so like that's 70 grams per hectare of biomass. It was grazed down to that at the end of June, and it only had a barely significant yield impact, 10%. This probably wasn't even statistically significant. So it's incredibly safe to graze the bejesus out of it back here. But then you get to this period that's pretty interesting where you're really getting to the end of having enough time to recover, and therefore the biomass you leave becomes really important. So you see these crops up here that had 1.5 tonnes to sort of, and this one had 3.9 tonnes, but this one only had 1.6 tonnes. No effect on yield at all. But as soon as you come down here to sort of a bit less than a tonne, 0.6 of a tonne, 0.3 of a tonne, and this one here 0.2, you're then starting to take a bit of a hit on yield. And then if you're really late locking up, it doesn't really matter how much. Here there's 1.5 tonnes. This one had 1.5 tonnes left, but it still took a 50% yield penalty. So you're just too late there, no matter how much biomass you leave, for the thing to catch up. You haven't left enough time for it to recover its biomass to create the yield potential that it has at that site. So this, I think, is where the next step is to get some better rules of thumb around the physiologically safe window rather than the phenologically safe, and then we've got to get good at judging it, I guess, visually judging it and measuring it. So that's for young, and it'll be different, I guess, depending on where you are. Rob, I think, did a great job of talking about this, and we moved from understanding the nuts and bolts of how to graze canola, how to graze wheat, when to lock up, what happens to blackleg. We moved from that in the last project to trying to put the whole thing together in a system, and we can't do it as well as a farmer, but we basically recognised that the reason a lot of people were doing this canola was not necessarily for this straight yield benefit, but all of the systems benefits. I mean, canola was a break crop, they wanted to do that. If you have the canola and wheat in your system, you widen your grazing windows, you widen your operational windows, you increase this winter pasture spell. So there were a whole lot of systems benefits that we were getting out of it. And here's a farmer from Goulburn whose family have been growing wool, fine wool, since 1820. And in the last 10 years he's moved to, he's doing the dual purpose wheat and canola and a whole range of different things, and just really opened up and diversified his system in the same way Rob talked about. And he was on Landline last year talking about grazing crops on his place. So we wanted to try and see if we could put a value on some of this. So exactly what Rob told me we shouldn't be doing, we have been trying to do, because it really was obviously what was driving a lot of people. And we have this Ginninderra research station in Canberra where we can do experiments with animals. We can put them on reasonable sized plots, we can weigh them and play around with them. So we had this integrated trial where we had pasture areas, and when we took the animals off the pasture areas onto the crop, we sort of measured what the value to the pasture was. And we were weighing the animals and getting live weight gain, and so we were able to sort of look at this whole integrated system when you're able to move animals off the pasture onto the canola, off the canola onto the wheat, and then back onto the pasture. What was the benefit from the spelled pasture? And so you see here's the canola and wheat in that experiment before we grazed it, and here's the animals grazing the continuous pasture, getting a bit sort of tight in the winter. Then we move the animals off onto the crops and graze them down, and you can see the pasture recovering, this spelled pasture. By the time we come off this, and in this area, you might get 2 months grazing. This is in Canberra. This pasture wedge here is worth a lot to the system, and we valued it all because we were measuring the animals, and the interesting thing was that if you just look at the extra grazing that we got in the system from having the crops, compared to just having a pasture-only system, this was the extra grazing we got off the crops, which is pretty easy to measure, canola only, wheat only, and then a system with both. But this was the extra grazing we got from the pasture after we put the animals back on. So 30 to 40% of the extra grazing came from spelling the pasture, which we found, which surprised us, I guess. We knew it was valuable, but it was quite valuable. How that plays out on a whole farm depends on your proportion of crop and pasture and what value you can get from it. But
and the length, your 2 months, which is...
Yeah. Well, I'll just show you. That's 2010. Incredible year for dual-purpose crops. They all went in early in March. We had fantastic season. 2.5 months of grazing. In 2011, much later sowing, much colder and drier winter, and a lot less pasture. But when you look at the extra grazing you got from the grazed crops, I mean, they're almost worth as much, if not more, in those dry seasons because the pasture was so poor. And so the pasture spelling proportion almost went up. These numbers are lower because the overall grazing was lower, but the value of the pasture spelling was still there. So, that was one of the things we were trying to get a handle on. Obviously, as Rob said, you only make money out of these grazing crops through your animals, and so basically you have to be prepared to capitalise on all this extra feed, and somehow you've got to increase your stocking rate, and they're your three options. We've got all the animal data on that. Hugh Dove's the animal person. I'm not the animal person, but Hugh's got all that data, so we're going to try and put that story together. We're now, through that project, we had that core site here, but we've been working with people all around the country, including Mark over here, and looking to see how this works. We've been using our models we've been putting all the information on how these crops grow and recover and into our models so that we can move to places where people haven't done it before. You get different problems in different areas. In southern Victoria, what they're running into is the problem of wet paddocks in the middle of winter that they don't want to put their animals on, so you set yourself up with all this extra feed, you can't get the animals on. How do you manage that risk? That's in Tasmania, so that's one of the issues in that area. Here's an example of where we used some of the information we had from the winter canola Taurus that we've been using. A guy in Armidale wanted to grow some and said, how would it work up here? And so we were able to use our models with the data we had from Canberra and other places, and basically look at. So here's the frost risk from different sowing dates. Here's the frost risk, and here's the heat risk going up that way. Sorry. So you're looking to try and sow it at a time when you minimise the frost and heat risk. The bottom graph is what we estimated the grazing days. You can work out what the growth is from a certain sowing time, how much biomass you'll have, what's the stocking rate you can get off that biomass before the thing starts to elongate, and what yield is it likely to give you. And so we sort of estimated that early April was the best time for him to go, and he's done that, and he had pretty good success last year. So that's sort of what we're trying to do with people in different areas. So as was mentioned, I came over last year to have a look at Mark's trials and Jonathan and the group took me around to a whole lot of places. And I suppose the thing that struck me was the fact that you guys have sort of huge paddocks. You have trouble getting in early because you've got a dry summer, and then you often have difficult soils, non-wetting soils, or weed problems that doesn't make you want to dive in and sow on the first rain. So you're getting pushed from that end. And then at the other end you have hot winds and tough finishes coming in at the other end. So you can see that the whole system that we're used to in the east a bit more mild and a longer season to play with. You guys were constrained, so I could really see how barley had a good fit in that system, and saw a lot of barley crops being grazed. But I was just thinking about it last night and trying to get it straight in my own head. And if we go back to that diagram I showed you of the year and the sowing and the grazing, the flowering, basically over here, it seems to me, you've sort of got the dry summers and the weeds and the non-wetting soils making it difficult for you to do anything other than sort of get things in around April at this end. You've got dry springs and hot temperatures always putting sort of pressure on you to keep that flowering window, you know, right where it is. And so this kind of sets your yield potential. And we're basically running on phenology rules at the moment, saying you must stop, you know, when the crop's at a certain stage. But I guess that yield potential, whatever it is always associated with a certain biomass at flowering. So if you think you know what your yield potential is, then you can estimate what flowering biomass you need. You know, there's no point having more biomass at flowering than you need. Your crop's only got to get to that flowering biomass to give you the yield you need. And why we've been able to graze and not lose yield is because mostly our crops produce far more biomass than they need. So if you know that, you're in a position then to say, well, if I've got to get to that target biomass to achieve this yield, I can work my way back and say, I know how much time I've got to get there. I can therefore work out what the residual biomass for recovery has to be. And I think that's sort of where we're at. That's obviously going to change from place to place, but this is what we have to populate now, I think, because this rule, you know, these Z30 and other rules may no longer be sufficient when you're in a system where you're trying to push everything and keep this window where it is to get you the yield. And I suppose where you're really not wanting to compromise on yield. Yeah, and so I don't know why I put that in again.
That's the type of thing
That's the type of thing we need data for in Western Australia, and I haven't even that is, you know, for a certain sowing time, and that's at young. And here's a season that, incidentally, here's a season that went crap in spring, and so here, because it went crap in spring, the yield potential wasn't very high. The biomass you need, therefore, when you stop grazing is not very high. Therefore, you get away with a lot later grazing. See, it crashed here, it crashed down to there in September, but I got away with grazing that year because it was a crap spring.
100% of bugger all is still bugger all.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, in fact, we made, in the howling droughts, like in 2006 when everybody's crop failed, the guys that grazed made money and the guys that didn't graze made a bigger loss. But, you know, you don't know that at the time. You often don't know that at the time you're having to make these decisions. Just to show you the other interesting data that's coming out is that, so I think we need to focus on spring types because that's what's going to be grazed. We need to understand, we need to get beyond phenology rules and start thinking about residual biomass rules. And we need to recognise that varieties are doing different things. Here's Crusader and Gregory in a Gatton experiment at Gatton last year. This is running out of puff, but you can see the two lines. It's ungrazed at the top. Here's the two varieties. Days after the first cut. Here's the uncut, and this is just leaf area index, so it's sort of a proxy for biomass. But the ones that were cut at growth stage 25, you can just see how the Crusader is recovering much better than the Gregory. And that happened at each time. As you got later, the same thing was still happening. But if you imagine that you need a certain leaf area index, you know, at flowering to support a certain yield potential, and say it was 2, you can see here that those two varieties are going to perform very differently even though they've been cut at the same time. Because one recovers that biomass very quickly compared to the other one. So this again I think is what we need more of, and we need it in all of the areas, I think, because in all of the areas it's mostly spring types of canola and cereals that are getting grazed. You want to talk about the new projects now or later?
Yeah,
okay.
Later.
All right, I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. That's been great. John, a round of applause, please.
What's the implication, say, of the early digger wheat material for this sort of thing?
Yeah, well, should be fantastic, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, provided there's no other traits with it that make it not recover well. I would think that probably the stuff that's vigorous does recover quickly too, if it's got a propensity for rapid growth and recovery.
That's huge, really.
Yeah, yeah.